June 16, 1904. The morning in Helsinki begins without drama. No crowds, no alarms, no visible sign that anything unusual is about to happen. People walk across Senate Square as they do every day. Clerks head to work. Students pass by the stone buildings without looking up. Life continues in its ordinary rhythm. Inside the Senate building, Nikolai Bobrikov is already at work. Bobrikov is not just another official. He is the Governor-General of Finland, the personal representative of the Russian Tsar, and the most powerful man in the country. In recent years, his authority has grown far beyond that of his predecessors. He does not merely oversee Finland, he controls it. Down the corridor, a young man enters the building. He is well dressed, calm, unremarkable. No one stops him. No one questions why he is there. His name is Eugen Schauman. He carries a revolver in his pocket. He also carries poison. And he carries something else that weighs even heavier: conviction. Schauman has already decided how this day will end. He has planned it carefully. He has written letters. He has thought through the consequences. He does not expect to survive. This is not an act of desperation. It is an act of intent. Within moments, 2 shots will be fired inside this building. One will strike Bobrikov. The other will strike Schauman himself. Both men will be mortally wounded. The event will last only seconds. The meaning of it will last generations. Because this assassination will divide Finland in a way few events ever have. It will force Finns to confront an uncomfortable question. Can political murder ever be justified? And if it can, who gets to decide? To understand why this question mattered so deeply, and why it still does, we need to step back. Far back. Before the gunshots. Before the hatred. Before Eugen Schauman ever picked up a weapon. We need to understand what Finland was, and what it feared it was about to lose. At the start of the 20th century, Finland did not exist as an independent nation. It was an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. That word, autonomous, carried enormous emotional weight. Finland had its own legal system, its own administration, its own Lutheran church, its own language rights, its own civil traditions. Compared to many other regions of the Russian Empire, Finland enjoyed exceptional freedoms. For decades, this arrangement created a fragile but workable balance. Finns governed themselves internally while remaining loyal subjects of the Tsar. But this balance was never guaranteed. Autonomy was not a right. It was a privilege granted by imperial authority. And by the late 19th century, that authority was growing nervous. Across Europe, nationalism was rising. Empires were cracking. Minority cultures were demanding recognition. From the Russian perspective, diversity no longer looked like strength. It looked like vulnerability. Finland, with its separate laws and strong national identity, began to appear dangerous. The solution developed in St. Petersburg was gradual integration, or more bluntly, assimilation. This policy would later be known as Russification. At first, the changes seemed technical: administrative adjustments, legal harmonization, bureaucratic reforms. But their impact was profound. Russian law was declared superior to Finnish law. Decisions made in Helsinki could be overridden by imperial decree. The Finnish army was dismantled. Conscription was brought under Russian control. Language became political. Russian was promoted in administration. Finnish autonomy was reframed as disobedience. For many Finns, this felt like watching their country slowly dissolve. The response, at first, was restrained. Petitions were organized. One of them gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, an extraordinary number for the time. Delegations traveled to St. Petersburg to plead Finland's case directly to the Tsar. They believed in legality. They believed in loyalty. They believed in reason. None of it worked. The petitions were ignored. The delegations were dismissed. The policies continued. This failure planted a quiet, dangerous thought in many minds. What if obedience no longer protected anything? What if the law itself had become the instrument of oppression? It was in this climate that Nikolai Bobrikov arrived in Finland. Bobrikov was appointed Governor-General in 1898. Unlike previous governors, he was not chosen to preserve compromise. He was chosen to impose order. Bobrikov believed Finland had been indulged for too long. He believed autonomy had bred resistance, and he believed firmness would restore loyalty. Once in office, he moved quickly. Censorship expanded, newspapers were monitored, political organizations were restricted, civil servants were forced to swear loyalty not just to the Tsar, but to imperial policy. Those who resisted were removed. In 1903, Bobrikov received extraordinary powers that changed everything. He was authorized to rule by decree. He could dismiss officials without trial. He could override Finnish institutions entirely. From that moment on, Finland's autonomy existed largely in name only. To the Russian Empire, Bobrikov was effective. He reduced open resistance, he enforced policy, he demonstrated control. To many Finns, he became something else entirely, a symbol, a reminder that peaceful resistance had failed, a living embodiment of foreign rule, a man whose presence alone represented humiliation. Hatred toward Bobrikov spread quietly, rarely spoken aloud, shared in private conversations, expressed in coded language. And in one young man, that hatred hardened into certainty. Eugen Schauman was not born into poverty or desperation. He came from a respected Finnish-Swedish family. He was educated, disciplined, and socially secure. That matters. Because Schauman was not driven by chaos. He was driven by belief. He read obsessively. He followed political developments closely. He kept a diary in which he wrestled with moral responsibility and national duty. Over time, his thinking narrowed. If the law had failed Finland, then breaking the law might become necessary. If peaceful protest achieved nothing, then sacrifice might speak louder. Schauman did not see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a tool, a final argument. And once he accepted that role, there was no turning back. By the time he entered the Senate building on that June morning, the decision had already been made. Not in anger, not in panic, but in cold, deliberate resolve. The shots that followed were not the beginning of this story. They were its irreversible point. Eugen Schauman did not wake up one morning and decide to kill a man. That idea is important, because it is often misunderstood. Political assassinations are frequently explained as moments of madness or emotional collapse. Schauman's case does not fit that pattern. His decision developed gradually through years of observation, reading, and internal argument. To understand how he reached that point, we need to look at who he was before he became a symbol. Schauman was born in 1875 into a Finnish-Swedish family with a strong sense of duty and public service. His father was involved in politics and administration. The household valued education, discipline, and loyalty to Finland. This was not a radical environment. It was respectable, orderly, and civic-minded. Schauman was intelligent and introspective. He read widely, especially history and political theory. He followed events in Finland closely and tried to make sense of them in moral terms. He was not impulsive. He was methodical. As Russification intensified, Schauman became increasingly preoccupied with the idea of responsibility. Not responsibility in the abstract, but personal responsibility. What does a citizen owe his country when the law no longer protects it? This question haunted him. For a long time, Schauman believed in peaceful resistance. He supported petitions and legal opposition. He followed debates among Finnish politicians and intellectuals who argued that endurance and legality would eventually prevail. But year after year, nothing changed. Bobrikov's power expanded. Finnish officials were dismissed. The autonomy that had once seemed stable now appeared hollow. In Schauman's diary, frustration began to harden into something darker. He wrote about sacrifice. He wrote about duty. He wrote about the idea that history sometimes demands individuals to act when institutions fail. This was not revolutionary ideology in the modern sense. It was moral absolutism. Schauman increasingly framed the situation as a binary choice. Either Finland would accept slow cultural death, or someone would have to intervene. And if intervention required breaking the law, then so be it. This is where Schauman's thinking became dangerous. He stopped asking whether violence was justified. He began asking whether it was necessary. Once framed that way, the conclusion felt inevitable. Schauman believed that Bobrikov was not merely an administrator. He saw him as the embodiment of oppression itself. Remove the symbol, and you weaken the system. He did not believe that killing Bobrikov would immediately free Finland. He was not naive. What he believed was that the act would awaken something, that it would force people to confront what was happening, that it would shatter the illusion that autonomy still existed. In his mind, the assassination was not an end. It was a message. And messages, he believed, sometimes require blood. Crucially, Schauman never planned to survive. This detail matters deeply. He knew that escape would turn the act into a crime. Survival would make it self-serving. Martyrdom, in his mind, transformed the act into sacrifice. That is why he carried poison. That is why he wrote farewell letters. That is why he arranged his affairs. He did not want a trial. He did not want a platform. He wanted silence after the act. In his diary, Schauman wrote with chilling clarity about his intentions. He described his own death as necessary. He framed it as a payment. This was not suicidal despair. It was moral accounting. And this is what makes Schauman so unsettling. He was calm. He was rational. He believed he was doing the right thing. As the date approached, he rehearsed the plan repeatedly in his mind. He studied Bobrikov's routines. He chose the location carefully. The Senate building was symbolic. It represented Finnish governance, now hollowed out by imperial power. Striking there would carry meaning beyond the act itself. On the morning of June 16, 1904, Schauman was composed. He dressed neatly. He carried his revolver. He carried poison. He carried the certainty that history would judge him, but he would not be there to hear the verdict. Inside the Senate building, Bobrikov was unaware of what was coming. That detail is often mentioned, but rarely examined. Bobrikov knew he was hated. He lived under constant threat. He was guarded. But power has a way of dulling danger. He had survived years of resentment. He believed control would endure. When Schauman approached him in the corridor, there was no warning. The shots came suddenly. One struck Bobrikov in the abdomen. Another ensured the wound was fatal. Immediately after, Schauman turned the revolver on himself. He did not hesitate. He did not falter. The sound of the second shot ended the act. Both men would die from their wounds. The entire event lasted seconds, but its psychological impact was immediate. News spread rapidly through Helsinki and beyond. At first, confusion dominated, then shock, then something more complex. Because Finns did not react with a single emotion. Some were horrified, some were frightened, some were quietly relieved. Publicly, the assassination was condemned. Russian authorities called it terrorism. Finnish officials expressed loyalty and urged calm. But privately, something else unfolded. People whispered Schauman's name with reverence. Flowers appeared at the site. Poems were written and circulated. His grave became a place of silent pilgrimage. For many, Schauman had done what they felt powerless to do. For others, he had crossed an unforgivable line. The nation was split, not along simple political lines, but along moral ones. Was this an act of courage or a descent into violence? Was Schauman a patriot or a warning? And perhaps most troubling of all, if peaceful resistance had failed so completely, what did that say about the future? These questions did not fade, they lingered, and they would shape Finnish political thought long after both men were gone. In the hours following the assassination, Helsinki did not erupt. There were no riots, no mass celebrations, no public demonstrations of joy. Instead, there was silence. People gathered in small groups. They spoke quietly. Newspapers struggled to decide how to describe what had happened. Officials weighed every word, knowing that Russia was watching closely. The Russian Empire reacted first. From St. Petersburg, the message was clear and immediate. This was terrorism. This was treason. This was proof that Finland could not be trusted with autonomy. Extra security was ordered. Surveillance intensified. Loyal statements were demanded from Finnish authorities. The assassination of Bobrikov was not framed as an isolated act by one man. It was framed as a symptom, a disease, evidence that Finland's special status had gone too far. Within Finland's official institutions, fear dominated. Civil servants worried about their positions. Politicians worried about retaliation. Many understood that anything resembling approval could trigger severe consequences. So, publicly, condemnation followed. Statements emphasized law and order. Violence was rejected. Loyalty to the Tsar was reaffirmed. But beneath this official surface, a parallel reality existed. Among ordinary Finns, the reaction was far more complex. People read the news slowly, carefully, between the lines. They paid attention to what was not said, as much as to what was. And many felt something they did not dare express openly: relief. Not because Bobrikov was dead, but because someone had finally acted. For years, Finns had watched their autonomy erode piece by piece. They had signed petitions. They had obeyed the law. They had trusted that endurance would preserve something essential. Instead, they had been ignored. Schauman's act shattered the illusion that obedience was enough. Almost immediately, his image began to change. Officially, he was a criminal. Privately, he became a symbol. Flowers appeared near the Senate building. Notes were left quietly. Poems circulated in handwritten form. These were not organized acts. There was no central movement. This was spontaneous and decentralized. That is what made it powerful. Schauman's grave quickly became a place of pilgrimage. People came alone. They did not stay long. They did not speak. They stood in silence and left. This quiet reverence alarmed authorities far more than open protest ever had, because it suggested that Schauman's act had reached something deeper than politics. It had reached identity. At the same time, opposition emerged just as strongly. Many Finns were deeply uncomfortable with what was happening. They feared that glorifying Schauman would legitimize violence. They worried about what kind of nation Finland would become if assassination were celebrated. Some argued that Schauman had damaged Finland's cause by confirming Russian fears, that he had handed the empire an excuse to tighten control. Others believed that once violence entered politics, it could not be contained. These voices were quieter, but they were present. The country was not united in praise. It was divided by conscience. This division would never fully disappear. In the months that followed, Russia adjusted its strategy. Bobrikov was gone, but the system remained. Russification did not end overnight. Autonomy was not restored. But the empire became more cautious. The assassination had exposed vulnerability. It had shown that even the most powerful imperial representatives were not untouchable. At the same time, Finland's political landscape began to shift. Radicalism did not immediately dominate, but the belief that passive resistance alone was sufficient began to erode. Younger activists began to question the older generation's strategies. Underground networks expanded. The language of sacrifice and duty became more common. Schauman's act did not create these movements, but it legitimized their existence. It showed that resistance could take a different form. Importantly, Schauman himself did not become a leader in the traditional sense. He left no organization behind, no doctrine, no political program. He left an example, and examples are dangerous, because they can be interpreted in many ways. Some saw Schauman as a tragic necessity, a man who did what others could not. Some saw him as a reckless fanatic whose actions risked everything. Both interpretations were rooted in truth. This ambiguity ensured that Schauman would never be a simple hero, and that complexity is why his legacy endured. As years passed, Schauman's image became increasingly symbolic. He was written into poems, referenced in speeches, and quietly commemorated in private spaces. Yet he was rarely discussed openly in official contexts. He was too controversial, too morally unstable. The state could not fully embrace him, but it could not erase him either. This tension mirrored Finland's broader struggle. The country was moving toward independence, but it had not yet decided what kind of nation it wanted to be. One built on law and compromise, or one forged through sacrifice and rupture. Schauman's assassination forced Finns to confront that question long before independence arrived. And when independence finally came in 1917, the question did not disappear. It returned in new forms. During the Civil War, during debates about punishment and justice, during discussions about political violence and state authority, Schauman became a reference point. Not because people wanted to repeat what he had done, but because they wanted to understand whether it had been unavoidable. History rarely offers clean answers. It offers moments that reveal who we are when pressure strips away comfort. June 16th, 1904 was such a moment, and Finland has been arguing with it ever since. As time passed, the immediate shock of the assassination began to settle into something more enduring: memory. How Finland remembered Eugen Schauman mattered just as much as what he had done. In the years following 1904, the country moved forward cautiously. Russification did not disappear, but its intensity fluctuated. The Russian Empire itself was weakening, shaken by unrest, war, and internal instability. Finland remained trapped between obedience and resistance. Schauman's act hovered in the background of this period, like an unspoken reference. It was rarely invoked directly, but it shaped how people thought about limits. How far could the state push before resistance became inevitable? How much could be endured before legality lost its meaning? For younger activists, Schauman became proof that individual action mattered, that history was not shaped only by institutions and decrees, but by choices made by ordinary people. For moderates, he became a cautionary figure, evidence of what happens when political pressure destroys moral restraint. Both interpretations coexisted uneasily. What made Schauman particularly difficult to place was that he never sought power. He did not lead a movement. He did not speak publicly. He left no ideology behind. He acted once, decisively, and disappeared. This made him easy to mythologize. Over time, Schauman's image was reshaped to fit different needs. To nationalists, he was the man who dared to strike the empire. To poets, he was a tragic figure who sacrificed himself for an idea. To critics, he was a reminder that violence corrupts even just causes. None of these images were entirely wrong, and none were complete. As Finland approached independence, political leaders faced a dilemma. They needed to build a state based on law, not vengeance. On institutions, not martyrdom. On democracy, not assassination. At the same time, they could not deny the emotional power of Schauman's legacy. He represented something raw and undeniable, a refusal to accept erasure. This tension became especially visible after 1917, when Finland finally declared independence. The new nation had to decide which stories to elevate and which to restrain. Schauman was not erased from history, but he was carefully handled. He was remembered privately more than publicly. His grave remained a place of quiet respect. His name appeared in literature more often than in official speeches. The state chose a different foundation. Instead of glorifying violence, Finland elevated law, courts, parliament, civil responsibility. This choice was not inevitable. It was deliberate, and it was shaped by the awareness of how close the country had come to another path. Schauman's act served as a warning as much as an inspiration. It showed what happens when political systems close all peaceful avenues, but it also showed the cost of crossing that final line. During Finland's civil war in 1918, these questions returned with devastating force. Violence became widespread. Brother fought brother. The moral clarity that Schauman believed in vanished entirely. Afterward, the country was left traumatized. In that aftermath, Schauman's assassination was re-examined again. Some argued that it had opened the door to a culture of political violence. Others insisted it was fundamentally different. A targeted act, not mass bloodshed. These debates were never fully resolved. They did not need to be. What mattered was that Finland emerged from its early years with a deep skepticism toward political violence. This skepticism became part of the national character. Even when resistance was justified, restraint was valued. Even when anger was understandable, law was prioritized. In this sense, Schauman's legacy is paradoxical. He committed an act of violence that helped push Finland toward a future defined by non-violence. Not because his act was imitated, but because it revealed where imitation would lead. History often works this way. Moments of rupture clarify values more sharply than decades of stability. Schauman forced Finland to ask itself what kind of freedom it wanted. Freedom built on fear, or freedom built on responsibility? The answer did not come immediately. It emerged slowly, through mistakes, suffering, and hard choices. And by the time Finland fully settled into its democratic identity, Schauman had become something quieter than a hero. He had become a boundary, a reminder of what lies beyond patience, and of what should never become normal. Judging Eugen Schauman has never been easy. That difficulty is not a failure of history, it is one of its truths. From the moment the shots were fired, Schauman existed in a space between categories. He did not fit cleanly into the language of crime, nor did he fit comfortably into the language of heroism. And Finland has never fully resolved that tension. In schools, Schauman is mentioned briefly. His act is described factually, dates, names, consequences. The moral weight is often left unspoken. This silence is intentional. It reflects an understanding that simple answers would distort the truth. Was Schauman a patriot? Many Finns instinctively say yes. He acted against oppression. He targeted a symbol of imperial domination. He sacrificed his own life. His motives were not selfish. But patriotism alone does not absolve violence. Was Schauman a terrorist? By modern definitions, he used violence to achieve political goals. He assassinated a government official. He sought to influence society through shock. That description also fits. Yet applying modern labels too rigidly risks flattening the historical context. Schauman did not act in a democratic system. He did not have meaningful political channels. He was not seeking personal power or recognition. He was responding to a closed system. This is where judgment becomes difficult. History does not ask whether Schauman was right or wrong in isolation. It asks what conditions made his decision possible. And those conditions were created by sustained pressure, legal erosion, and the collapse of trust between ruler and ruled. Schauman did not invent Finnish resistance. He did not invent Russification. He did not invent repression. But he made visible what had been happening quietly. That visibility came at a cost. By killing Bobrikov, Schauman forced Finland to confront the reality that politics had reached a breaking point. But he also forced the country to confront the danger of moral absolutism. Because once violence is framed as duty, it becomes difficult to contain. This realization deeply influenced Finland's later political culture. In the decades that followed independence, Finland consistently rejected political assassination as a tool. Even during moments of extreme tension, restraint was emphasized. The legal system was strengthened. Democratic norms were reinforced. Compromise became a core value, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was understood. Schauman's act loomed in the background of these choices, not as an example to follow, but as a reminder of what happens when systems fail completely. Public commemoration of Schauman has always been careful. There are no grand statues in central squares, no official holidays, no state-sponsored glorification. At the same time, his grave has never been neglected. His name has never been erased. His story has never been denied. This balance reflects Finland's relationship with its own past. Respect without celebration, recognition without endorsement. In literature and art, Schauman appears more freely. Writers explore his psychology. Poets dwell on his isolation. Artists portray him as tragic rather than triumphant. These interpretations are telling. They suggest that Finland understands Schauman not as a model citizen, but as a symptom of a moment when the social contract broke down. And this understanding carries a warning. If institutions fail long enough, individuals will attempt to replace them, sometimes with noble intentions, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. Schauman believed he was acting for Finland. History neither fully confirms nor fully rejects that belief. What history does confirm is that his act changed the conversation. It stripped away illusions. It revealed the stakes. It forced moral clarity. And it left Finland with a responsibility to build a society where such acts would never feel necessary again. That responsibility did not end in 1904. It did not end with independence. It did not end with democracy. It continues. Every generation inherits the question Schauman raised. What do you do when power ignores law? What do you do when legality becomes hollow? What do you do when patience begins to look like surrender? Finland's answer, over time, has been consistent. You strengthen institutions. You protect democracy. You argue instead of shoot. That answer was not obvious in 1904. It was forged through pain. And that is why Schauman's story remains uncomfortable. It reminds us that democracy is not guaranteed. That restraint is learned, not automatic. That violence always feels simple in the moment and devastating in retrospect. Schauman chose certainty over compromise. Finland chose the opposite. And in that choice lies the country's true legacy. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to arrange history into a clean line. Oppression leads to resistance. Resistance leads to independence. Independence leads to democracy. But Finland's path was never that simple. Eugen Schauman stands as a reminder of how fragile that line truly was. He acted at a moment when faith in law had collapsed, when petitions were ignored, when autonomy existed only as a memory, when the future felt like slow erasure. In that moment, Schauman chose violence as language. He believed it was the only one left. What followed was not liberation. It was not clarity. It was not resolution. It was uncertainty. Yet that uncertainty proved decisive. Because Finland did not follow Schauman's path forward. It paused. It reflected. It argued. And over time, it chose something harder than martyrdom. It chose restraint. This choice becomes clearer when Schauman's act is placed alongside what came later. In 1922, Heikki Ritavuori was assassinated in Helsinki. He was not a representative of foreign power. He was a Finnish minister in a democratic government. His murder tested Finland in a different way. This time the response was unambiguous. There was no quiet admiration, no moral ambiguity, no hesitation. The state condemned the act fully. The public rejected it. Political violence was not mythologized. It was confronted. That response did not come from nowhere. It was shaped by earlier moments, by Schauman, by the Civil War, by everything Finland had already endured. Between 1904 and 1922, the country learned something painful. Violence may awaken a nation, but it cannot govern one. Schauman's assassination forced Finland to recognize how dangerous unchecked power could become. Rita Vori's assassination forced Finland to recognize how dangerous unchecked violence could be. Together, these moments frame the moral boundaries of Finnish democracy. One shows what happens when authority refuses to listen. The other shows what happens when disagreement turns lethal. Between them lies the lesson Finland carried forward. Democracy survives only when both power and resistance accept limits. This is why Schauman remains difficult to place. He is not celebrated as a founder. He is not condemned as a villain. He is remembered as a rupture. A moment when the nation looked over the edge and chose not to jump. Today, Schauman's story is often told quietly, sometimes awkwardly, often without conclusions. That silence is not avoidance. It is maturity. It reflects an understanding that some historical figures are not meant to inspire imitation. They are meant to inspire vigilance. Schauman reminds us that systems can fail, that legality can become hollow, that individuals can feel forced into impossible choices. But he also reminds us that violence simplifies moral landscapes in dangerous ways. It replaces dialogue with finality. It replaces accountability with martyrdom. It replaces shared responsibility with irreversible acts. Finland learned this the hard way, and that learning shaped everything that followed. The country built strong institutions not because it trusted power, but because it distrusted it. It valued consensus, not because it was weak, but because it knew what replaced it. This is the deeper legacy of Eugen Schauman. Not the gunshots, not the blood, but the caution that followed. History rarely gives us pure heroes or pure villains. Sometimes it gives us mirrors. Schauman is one of them. He reflects what happens when patience runs out, when law loses meaning, when a single individual decides to act for the whole. Finland saw that reflection and chose another path. That choice did not erase Schauman from history. It placed him where he belongs, at the edge, as a warning, as a question, as a reminder of what democracy must never forget.